So I want to talk about why authoritarian governments do so poorly in warfare versus democracies, or those kind of democratic republic governments that we see in the United States, in the United Kingdom, all over Europe. And the statistic that I've seen is that of the wars that Western democracies have fought, or just in general democracies, they've won 76% of their wars. When it comes to authoritarian governments, they've only won 46% of their wars. Now, the question is, why is that? Why are authoritarian governments struggling so mightily to win the wars that often they start? Let's be frank here. I mean, when you look at Iraq or even Russia, they struggle to win these wars. And there's a couple of reasons. Now, the first reason is that centralized head of government, which you would think would mean that it would make it a more smooth transition of orders. The president or whoever is in charge sends the orders down the line and they execute it. Well, the problem is you don't have any pushback. In the U.S. government, at all echelons of the chain of command, there's often pushback, and it is welcomed and it is actually expected. In fact, there's a scenario called red teaming that a lot of the U.S. government does, and it's actually a cross business too, where you have the quote devil's advocate, you have the enemy, the op 4 that will show you a mirror of yourself and tell you, this is a bad idea. I wouldn't do that shit if I was you. And when that comes up, you can make plans surrounding that. You can question the leadership. You can say, hey, this plan might not be great, but let's look at this other way of doing this, or other methods of conducting dissent within the chain of command. You don't have that in authoritarian governments. You don't have that all the way up to the top of the chain of command in the president. And we saw that in Russia when Putin basically forced his entire oligarch circle to sit down in the room 30 feet away from him and tell him, yes, they support Putin's plan to invade Ukraine. And when it was Putin's plan, we can now see how poorly it's going. Now, I'm not saying it was Putin's own plan entirely, but I'm just saying that enough of his yes men that he surrounds himself with gave him the thumbs up on what they were going to do, that no one was willing to say, this probably isn't a great idea, and here's what could potentially happen on the other side of things. You see that in the US, and that brings up a broader scenario within the US military and the Western military, United Kingdom, European military, Japan, South Korea, etc. They empower their lower level soldiers. There is the ability to think freely when you are a soldier in these westernized militaries, and that is very beneficial because the guy on ground knows the situation better than anyone else. And as I said, Putin was directly phoning the front line giving orders, and that you executed Putin's orders, or you could be seen as a dereliction of duty. You could be punished for that. Whereas in the U.S. military and other Western militaries, they give the strategic overview of what the mission is, but allow you to make the plan at the lower level to execute that. And that comes with a strong non-commissioned officer corps, NCO corps, which the United States has the best in the world, hands down. The NCO corps in the U.S. is incredible, and I was an Army officer, but I heavily leaned on the NCO Corps for those experience level decisions, those ones that require, hey, I've done this before, I've seen this before, this is what worked, this is what didn't work. NCOs are critical in that regard, and the NCO Corps and things like the Chinese military and the Russian military are very, very much hobbled. They are not given the opportunity to speak out. They're not given the opportunity to disagree with their officers, because again, that insubordination thing is a big deal within that realm. So they are hobbled, if they exist at all. And that's the reality, is often, especially within Russia, they don't exist because they don't give their soldiers enough time to move up. No one wants to stay in the Russian military long term, it seems. So the NCO Corps is essentially spineless. It's a spineless, non-existent organization within Russia. And because of that, their decision-making process is absolutely hobbled, because they have no one that's going to say no. No one's going to say no to Putin. In fact, no one's going to say no to Saddam, because people in those regimes were killed. Saddam often would shoot the messenger literally for bringing bad news. And we see that. So when you bring bad news and or when you're afraid to bring bad news, you're not going to bring it. So you can't adjust your tactics. You can't adjust your operations. And that's what we see in places like Russia. We keep seeing them beat their head against the same wall over and over again and fail over and over again. The other thing is they don't have a broad base of education within their military. Not only is it reliance on civilian education, as the U.S. military does, but also a broad base of military education. A lot of what soldiers do is go to schools to learn how to be better soldiers. They don't do that as much in the Russian military. They don't want a free-thinking military because free thinkers become dangerous. They become dangerous to the authoritarian government. Often that's who we see first take the initiative in authoritarian governments, and that's the military. And because of that, they hobble their own military. The Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein actually prevented their own military from conducting urban operations because Saddam Hussein was so afraid of his own military overthrowing him that they weren't allowed to do any kind of urban warfare. Obviously, a lot of the warfare that took place in Iraq when both the Gulf War and then in 2003 took place was in urban areas, and the U.S. military absolutely wrecked them, completely wiped them off the map. We see this in China and Russia, but in a different way. They hobble their militaries financially. When you're in an authoritarian government, you have to remember that your government operates in a manner that the people could easily turn on you. There's no succession plan in these governments. You don't see who's going to come after Putin. We've talked about who might come after Putin. It could be this oligarch. It could be that oligarch. They have a technical succession plan on paper, but the dude who's next in line is not going to be the dude who's going to be president. There are more powerful players that come to the forefront in Russia. Whereas in the United States, we know the succession plan. We know the succession plan even in a peaceful transition after an election. Putin has been largely the head of the government for the last 20-something years, like 23 years now, even though for a brief stint he and Medvedev switched position. But let's be honest, Putin was still in charge. Because of that, they have to worry about things like coups. They have to worry about assassinations. They have to worry about being overthrown. And because of that, they divert a portion of their military budget to their domestic defense, basically defending their circle of friends from being overthrown by a violent uprising. And we've seen this happen over and over again. So because of that, they can't externally focus their entire budget. There's been some estimates that anywhere between 25 to 40% of China's military budget is dedicated to domestic defense, meaning they're not externally focused. The United States puts nearly all of its military budget to externally focused war fighting. Where we see additional budgetary items is in things like the federal police, etc. That's where you see a budgetary difference. So even though China may say, hey, our military budget is this, you have to parse out a portion of that for the amount that is necessary to defend the Xi Jinping regime from the people's uprising, which has happened in China before. It's happened in Russia before. It's happened many times in these authoritarian governments. So because of that, because they can't empower their people to be free thinkers because they're afraid of them, because they have no NCO corps that is willing to say no, this isn't a good idea, and because they internally hobble themselves entirely due to a fear of uprising, so they have to build up a domestic defense system, they essentially will never be able to match the Western militaries who are more externally focused, who have dedicated secession plans that we know about, that we know who our next leader is, we know the process for selecting the next leader. Those things don't take place in authoritarian governments, and therefore that decision-making authority is always going to be subpar. And that is largely why you see a lot of authoritarian militaries do so poorly against even smaller democratic militaries.